Welcome, I'm Dr. Robert Gladner, Medical Advisor for Medscape Emergency Medicine. Today we have a distinguished panel joining us to discuss an important legal decision resulting in a criminal conviction involving a medical error due to administration of the wrong medication by a critical care nurse, resulting in a patient's death. Joining us to discuss this case is Dr. Megan Rainey, Professor of Emergency Medicine and the Academic Dean at Brown University School of Public Health. Also joining us is Dr. Jane Barnsteiner, Emeritus Professor, the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and also an expert in patient safety, quality improvement, and system modeling. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a joy to be with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here to discuss this very tragic case involving Redonda Vaught, who was an ICU nurse, who was recently convicted in Tennessee of criminally negligent homicide and gross neglect of an impaired adult after accidentally administering a paralytic medication, vecuronium, instead of a sedative, Versed, which was ordered to sedate a 75-year-old patient who had had a brain bleed and TBI. She was scheduled to have a PET scan. And after receiving the wrong medication and not really being monitored in any true way, just being in the care of an MRI tech, she had a cardiac arrest and subsequently died. So Dr. Rainey, I want to begin with you. And this started because I saw on Twitter you had written something that really stuck with me. And I'll quote you: "A culture of safety is one in which the system that allowed the mistake to happen has changed, not one in which the individual is scapegoated. And a culture of safety correlates with better patient outcomes that we know. This verdict is the opposite." And I'll let you go from here because, look, the system issue is the medication dispensing cabinet in my mind, and there was a medication override. And the question is, how did this override, how was it allowed to occur in the first place? And I want to go into that with you, with Jane as well.
I mean, my goodness, overrides happen every single day across this country, dozens of times a day in any particular shift. So I would think of the system as being much bigger than just the Pyxis or that kind of automated dispensing cabinet, but around the larger system of the verbal orders, the time pressures that the nurse is under, the fact that the nurse is with a trainee, the fact that they're being asked to operate outside of their normal environment by going down to MRI. There's a series of issues, just as we've thought about the Swiss cheese model for COVID-19. That model actually originated when we talked about patient safety and medical errors. It is a Swiss cheese of circumstances that allows this type of tragic error to occur. And many of us have worked for years on trying to change the system from one of punishing people, changing it from that punitive system, to rather a system where we can do root cause analysis, allow people to disclose errors, and allow us to inquire as to what are those series of Swiss cheese holes that allowed this mistake or any other to happen. When you punish people, you lead them to hide their mistakes instead of allowing them to disclose them and allowing that important inquiry to happen. So that's why this is just so harmful to that culture of safety that so many of us are trying to create.
Absolutely. It's a chilling verdict. And, in so many ways, I'm right on the same page with you, having worked for so long in the emergency department and seeing nurses that are overtaxed, overburdened, but also on patient floors. And this goes to, an ICU type environment where this woman was having a non-emergent PET scan and required some sedation. And the question I want to get to is that, the system that allowed the nurse to dispense this medication, though she was distracted, she'll admit that. Jane, I want to get to you in this.
Sure.
How can we avoid this? And what are the system checks that can be done in some fashion to make this safer and to avoid this tragic error?
Right. Well, first of all, I would say that you do not put in a major change as they were doing with their Epic system as a big bang, where you do the change through the entire organization. You do it in one area where you get the whole system smoothed out, all the errors and taken care of, so that you're not, first of all, having a problem, which they had through their entire organization, which required overrides multiple times a day. The other thing of it is, one of the things that's been recommended is that these systems, like the Pyxis system, have 5 letters. The first 5 letters of a medication have to be entered into the system, so that when you have multiple medications where the first 2 letters are the same, the chances of pulling out the wrong medication are much, much smaller if you have to put in the 5 letters. The other piece of it is you can have the high, first of all, there's a question of whether this medication, that curonium, should have even been in this particular system, machine. But you can have high alert medications like this in baggies that have on the front of the bag. This is a high alert medication. It requires 2 independent double checks. These are all the things that will help alert the fatigued or distracted nurse or physician. It will make things safer. So there are many things that can be put into place.
Right. It's almost like a hard stop. This is a different class of medication. And that, even if the nurse, I guess, had elapsed and didn't realize that there should have been a hard stop that, do you want this class? Because a sedative and a paralytic are 2 very different medications. And again, I'm not trying to assign any blame here. I'm just trying to look at mechanics of what happened and how, we can put in place methods to avoid these types of errors for a system that clearly is overtaxed and overburdened. Is it an AI alert? Is it a pharmacy alert that goes out? Is it, in other words, a Vocera message that gets triggered? Is something to stop the nurse from doing something that she knows, she's used the medicine before, apparently, Versed, and knows it's a liquid and doesn't have to be reconstituted. So in my mind, as a practicing doc for a long time, I see this and I see how it can happen, but there's ways I think we can address it. And Megan, I want to bring you into this and get your viewpoint.
So I'm going to say we're working in an environment right now, and obviously this happened pre-COVID, but we're working in an environment where medicines are constantly in short supply. We're constantly dealing with substitutions of one for another. This has worsened during COVID, but it existed in the pre-COVID era as well. We'd have time periods where, like today, we're out of D50 and we have to use D10, or it's a different formulation of a common antibiotic. So I could totally imagine that this nurse had been exposed to multiple medication substitutions, and so thought, they were rushing. They thought, well, they just put one thing in instead of another and didn't make that kind of cognitive connection. What we know so well from our studies of human factors engineering and the way that systems work is that when someone is cognitively overloaded and constantly having to think outside the box, constantly having to make decisions, particularly when they're exposed to a new system for ordering meds, there's only so much that the brain can do at a time. And this person was set up for this type of error. Again, not to say that they didn't do something wrong, but that's why we have a civil system. That's why we have licensing. That's why we have malpractice, right? To call this a criminal error when they were working within a system that had all these other problems where they were constantly having to make do for systems failures. It's almost inevitable that at some point something really horrible happens. I'm sorry that it was this nurse, and God, how horrible for the patient and the family. I'm not excusing that, but you can totally imagine as a practicing physician, nurse, or anyone else in the healthcare system, how this happens.
The other part of it was that they did not have in place at this time the barcoding system in this particular patient area. And so what nurses are used to doing is when they have to pull a medication, they're using the barcoding system to coordinate with what's in the electronic health record, with the medication, with the person's ID band. And so those are all well-known safety checks that obviously were used to being used by this nurse in the critical care unit, but that wasn't available in this MRI area. That is something that absolutely is a system failure, and that those kinds of safety systems have to be available any place in a health system where medications are being delivered.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important point. Here we have a technology that can, supersede, the ability of a human to make a mistake, and have that in place is very critical. But I want to go back to the idea of med mal versus, homicide charges. And Megan, you made a point of this, is that here, this nurse is now an example of someone who went to trial, was convicted, and it's going to have a chilling effect on healthcare providers, pre-COVID, post-COVID. It's just chilling. It makes people want to leave the field. it causes PTSD. The psychiatric downstream effects of such an error are just immense. And, I don't know in my mind how the DA went for, criminal charges here. And, again, I'm not an attorney. We don't have a legal expert with us, but, for this to have happened is just setting precedent that it's going to have the effect of really making so many people leave the field, in my mind.
I'm not a lawyer, but I've certainly been on the front lines, not just for the past 2 years during COVID, but for almost 20 years prior to that. And I will say that, and Jane knows this well too, that these types of errors are never events that sit with our colleagues and friends for their entire career. No one goes into medicine intending to hurt someone. The system fails us and fails the patient. There are certainly examples of intentional harm, and those people deserve to be prosecuted, right? But this type of thing where it was a system who let them down, again, it's do the inquiry of the system. Don't punish the individual to the point of putting them in jail. I think about, my last few months working in the emergency department, and what my nurses in particular have said to me, that they worry that they're going to lose their license, lose their ability to practice because of the horrific circumstances that we've been working in, the understaffing, the lack of access to standard meds, the long wait times, and on, right? They're not able to take care of patients the way that they've been taught to do. They're worried already about the downstream effects on their sense of self, as well as on their ability to maintain their livelihood. You put something like this on top of it, where again, an unintentional error that was potentiated by a somewhat broken system or by a series of Swiss cheese holes that just happened to line up. What message does that send to my nursing colleagues who have stayed on the front lines and who know that they have not been able to provide the standard of care that they're used to?
So I, on Friday, did a program on a fair and just culture with 3 health systems and a university school of nursing. And already what some of the faculty reported, that students are talking about transferring to another major outside of the school of nursing because of their worry about this particular guilty verdict. The other thing is that we already have a tremendous shortage of nurses. We've seen a lot of people leave the profession or retire in the last couple of years, and this is only going to compound it further. It is a sobering message that the public can't afford to have, actually, because this will actually impact the quality of care and the safety of care that can be delivered to people and families as a result of not having sufficient numbers of professionals to deliver care.
Absolutely. And that's such an important point. In any high reliability organization, culture of safety is key. The tenets we try to adhere to. When we have people leaving the field after seeing a case like this, it's chilling. We have to re-educate the public, and we need sort of a realignment of how errors are handled. And I think that, this is just the beginning. Her sentencing is going to be in about a month, and we'll see what happens on reckless homicide charges and also neglect. But I think there's going to be a follow-up to this, and we're going to need to discuss this more. So both of you, I just wanted to get a couple takeaways for our audience to just really, kind of sear in the brain what we can learn from such an event.
The big takeaway to me is just the importance of us both continuing to use our voices, but also working across professional boundaries to help to create this culture of safety, one in which we all feel safe and supported in advocating for systems that work for us. We cannot ask nurses, respiratory techs, radiology techs, physicians, or anyone else within the healthcare system to work unsupported. And we have to recognize the degree to which we are all interdependent. And so my biggest takeaway is for us to use our voices together.
And the takeaway that I would have from this, and what I'm working with a number of health systems on, is to have the chair of the board, the CEO of the hospital, the chief medical officer, and the chief nursing officer together promulgate a statement that is sent actually out to all employees as a result and discuss this verdict, and to say what they're doing to promote a high reliability organization and a fair and just culture, and to ask for open conversation and to let the top leadership know that any concerns that they have about vulnerabilities in the system But it's extremely important, I think, right now with this verdict, that the leaders in healthcare settings, as well as in education settings, to let people know what they'll be doing to protect their employees.
Jane, Megan, I want to thank you so much for such an important discussion, very informative, and I think there's going to be a follow-up to this that'll be very, very important. Thanks again.